Hi everyone! At this time of year, as the days get shorter and the nights get longer and the weather changes and the leaves start to fall off the trees, I am embracing Cozy Classics season. I am in the mood for magical, whimsical classics that transport me to another place, that do feel very cozy and warm inside. I like to think in some ways that I'm like a tiny little dormouse hibernating for the winter with a book. And that's the vibe that I am going for at the moment. So I wanted to do a little cozy classics vlog because, like I said, I'm embracing it. I am going for it and I'm enjoying finding books that match the theme. For me, the perfect start to cozy classics season was spending a few weekends in Yorkshire. At the end of September and the beginning of October, I was up in Haworth, the home of the Bronte sisters, for the Bronte Festival of Women's Writing. It is put on by the Bronte Parsonage Museum, the Bronte Society. As you may know, I am the chair of the Bronte Society, chair of the Board of Trustees. So I was up for the weekend. I got to visit the parsonage. Haven't been since the beginning of the year. It was so cool to see Branwell's portrait of Emily at home in the museum. It came home from the National Portrait Gallery, was on loan, and I've never seen it at the parsonage, so it just was the coolest thing. I couldn't stop staring at it. The events for the weekend were amazing too. I met Emerald Fennell, the director of the upcoming Wuthering Heights film. She was really lovely and also so enthusiastic about the Brontes and Wuthering Heights. I love the Brontes myself, as you know, but I don't think I've ever met a bigger Bronte fangirl in my life, so that was super cool. I chaired a panel as well with some lovely authors, and I was on a panel for my own book, so it just was the most amazing literary weekend, being surrounded by people who love the Brontes and who love books just as much as I do, and it's basically my favourite time of the year. Such a buzzing atmosphere where you kind of know you are surrounded by like-minded people. And I also, for the first time, got to take a stroll across the moor to the Bronte waterfall, which was just amazing. I had tried it a few years ago, but it was raining and I couldn't physically get down there, but I had like the moor almost to myself, just me and hares and birds of prey and grouse. It was just one of those nights that you kind of always remember. It was such a special place to the Brontes, and now I feel like, you know, I had that connection with it too. I am really excited to talk about the books that I have read recently and also what I'm currently reading, because, drum roll please, I think I have a new favourite book of all time. A new all-time favourite book. I've read a book and I love it so much with my whole heart. You know, when you have a book that just kind of sits in your soul and you love it and you can't stop thinking about it, it kind of permeates your entire life and your way of thinking, and you come to just live with this book. This book lives inside of you. That's how I feel about this book that I read recently. I almost don't want to talk about it because I don't want to break the sanctity of my relationship with it, but I love it so much and I want everybody to read it, but I also don't want anyone to read it because it feels like it's mine. I just read it and was like, my whole life has changed because I've read this book, which is the absolute best feeling ever, and I can't get it out of my head. I don't think I ever will. I just love it. I love it more than I can put into words, but I will try. And the book is Lolly Willowes by Sylvia Townsend Warner. Our main character, Laura Willowes, has always been the dutiful daughter to her father, who she was incredibly close with. She has been the doting sister to her two brothers and to their children. But in the first few pages of the novel, Laura's father dies, and this is the early 20th century, and so she doesn't necessarily have many prospects of her own, even though she has an inheritance that she is living off. So she goes to live with one of her brothers and his family in London. She gives up living in the family home in the rural countryside and she moves to the big city. And for many years, she sort of muddles along, looking after the children, again being the dutiful Aunt Lolly. That's always been her role, until eventually she gets fed up with it and decides that she's going to do something for herself. She casts off the domestic. She's in a shop one day and she sees these flowers that have come from a place called Great Mop. She finds a map of this place and decides she's going to live there. And I don't want to give too much away, but let's just say that when Lolly decides that she is going to embrace her own independence and live in Great Mop might not be the most conventional of places to live. The residents go walkabout in the night, and there is a sense of a greater being prowling in the shadows. It's a book that really should be absurd in places, and yet Sylvia Townsend Warner manages to rationalise the irrational. It is a book about everyday witches and about the role that women play in other people's lives, the maternal caregiving role, and whether that's something that we willingly give or it's something that is possible to cast aside. One of my favourite moments comes right at the end when Lolly says, one doesn't become a witch to run around being harmful or to run around being helpful either, a district visitor on a broomstick. It's to escape all that, to have a life of one's own, not an existence doled out to you by others. And really this does feel like a companion novel to A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. This is the novel that matches everything that Virginia Woolf says in her essay. It is about women having a life of one's own, a life that they choose, and Sylvia Townsend Warner writes with such depth, with such heart and soul, and that's why this book spoke to me on such a profound level and why it will stay with me for the rest of my life. I basically haven't put this down since. I reach for it all the time. I reread sections. It means so much to me, and I'm very sorry, but you're going to be hearing a lot about this book. But really, I'm not sorry because I love talking about it. And then the other book that I read recently was East Lynne by Mrs. Henry Wood. This is a Victorian sensation novel and it was absolutely ridiculous. I don't think I've ever read a book so silly in my whole life, and I loved every second of it. It was a task. This is quite a big book to get through, and there was so much going on and so many different moving parts that it was quite difficult sometimes keeping it in my head, but also just trying to get through it because I was like, what is gonna happen next? I do not know. I can't kind of predict it. I'm not really sure what's gonna happen, and yet also I could see what was gonna happen right from the beginning. This was published as a periodical, and I can kind of see why it would have worked better reading it in installments, but I don't know if I could have waited years to get to the end because I kind of knew the plot twist right at the beginning. But I imagine if you were a Victorian reader following it along and you wanted justice, it would be a much better experience if you had lived with these characters for a really long time and were like, I just need this to happen. It really is the weirdest book I've read for a very long time, and I don't know if I mean that in a positive or a negative way. I feel like if you're going to read a sensation novel, read Lady Audley's Secret, far better, but I'm really glad that I read this. It just was it was a fun, ridiculous time. I'm struggling with how best to talk about this book because in some ways I don't want to spoil you, and yet there are some really big things that happen in it that I feel like if I told you, you would want to go out and read it. So I'm gonna try my best. The book basically centers around this place called East Lynne. There's East and West Lynne, there's like the village, and then there's the home, and we have our country local lawyer, Mr. Carlyle, who is sort of up and coming, very respectable within his community. He has a sort of young admirer called Barbara Hare, who has loved him for many years. Her father is the local justice, and yet there's this hidden family secret because her brother has been accused of somebody's murder and has run off because if he is found, he will be executed. Very typical sensation novel, lot going on there. And then we also have the Vanes, Lord Vane and his daughter Lady Isabel Vane. Lady Isabel at the beginning of the novel is this sweet, often naive young woman who has been sheltered from many of her father's sort of gambling debts and general sense of impropriety propriety. She's bullied very easily and influenced very easily by others, and her father dies and she ends up marrying Mr. Carlisle, and they live at East Lynne. They have children together and it's a very happy marriage. And then the sort of roguish Francis Leveson comes in and steals her away. I'll stop there for plot specifics, but I'll tell you some of the other elements that we've got going on. So there is Barbara Hare's brother's falsely accused murder plot that kind of needs solving, a death and a change of identity, lots and lots of melodrama. There's infidelity and adultery, and of course, because of that, a very strong sense of the Victorian moral code. And as you read it, that's definitely something that you should be aware of, because you always have to ask yourself with this novel, how is the outcome affected by the Victorian sense of morality? Is there any other outcome that can happen from this book and for these characters, because this is the society that they are living within? And in many respects, the characters are trapped within this moral society that they live in, but also the book is trapped within the society it is being published into. And so I'm not quite sure how transgressive East Lynne is because of some of those outcomes, and yet it is kind of boundary pushing too. I'm just not quite sure it reaches the heights of other books that push those boundaries past those moral constraints. I'm glad that I've read it. I don't think I'd be rushing out to reread it anytime soon. This might be a one-off read. And now let's talk about the books that I am currently reading, and my main read at the moment is Hangsaman by Shirley Jackson. This is my first Shirley Jackson novel, although I have read some of her short stories, and I thought this would be perfect for spooky season, which it definitely is. It is unsettling, it's a little bit creepy, I read it and I'm a bit on edge all the time as I read this, in kind of the best way possible. That's exactly what I want from it, but it's quite a strange headspace to be in. So far in the novel, I have been introduced to the Waite family. So the daughter Natalie is about to go off to study at college/university. The father, Mr. Waite, is a sort of novelist who is struggling to work on his novel, and his wife, Mrs. Waite, whose domain exclusively is the kitchen, she plays the traditionally domestic role, but also we see the ways that that is restrictive to a woman's life. And there's also a son who is somewhat of the black sheep of the family. And my impression of it in these very early stages is that Shirley Jackson is setting up this perfectly domestic scene, and yet we are seeing the cracks in their living and the ways that these traditional roles are holding each of them back. But also it is only benefiting the men. And so what I'm really interested to know as I progress with it is, when Natalie goes off to university and when we see that, is that going to be a reflection of her escaping the domestic role that she otherwise would be given? Is it that type of novel, a sort of extreme casting off of the traditional gender roles that are given to us, or is Shirley Jackson going to do something else with it? That's what I'm really intrigued by at the moment. Also, the unsettling parts in these early stages of the book come from this sort of maladaptive daydreaming that Natalie does. She's having conversations with imaginary people all of the time and is sort of responding to them, but nobody can hear. And I'm fascinated by that as a kind of literary narrative device too. I'm very into it, and I've never seen it done quite like this before. I don't think this will be my last Shirley Jackson. And then finally, we have a book, or kind of 3 books, and a poetry collection by one of my favourite author discoveries of the year. We have Childhood Youth Dependency by Tove Ditlevsen, and her poetry collection, There Lives a Young Girl in Me Who Will Not Die. I love Tove Ditlevsen. I love her so much. I read The Faces earlier in the year, and that was, it sort of opened my eyes to her as a writer, and I was like, I know I'm going to read everything she ever wrote that has been translated, because she's a Danish author, and Childhood Youth Dependency is 3 of her autobiographical works. They've been published in one edition but were originally published separately. So we follow young Tove in her childhood, into her youth, and then as an adult. And the 3 work so perfectly as a collective body of work. She came from a relatively poor household living in Copenhagen. This is called the Copenhagen trilogy, and we see the ways in which childhood permeates your entire life. It isn't just just a distinct phase, although it is distinct in nature, but it's something that lives with you and that you take through into each stage of your life. And where that gets really interesting is that you then have the cumulative effect of taking your youth through with you into later life too. And so each book has its own narrative, and yet it flows so seamlessly that I feel so close to Tova as I am reading it, and I just feel for her, and I feel like I can relate to her even though I might not always understand her or her actions or her motives. In many respects, dependency and some of youth too are dealing with the often troubled relationships that Tova had, both her romantic relationships but also her familial relationships too. And yet the reality is that the most significant relationship that Tova had throughout her life was with her writing. And the parts that I've loved reading the most are about that burgeoning relationship with her poetry and that process of improvement and perseverance and actually having your writing discovered and getting out in the world. And I'm interested in this as a narrative because when she's talking about her relationship with her poetry, especially when she was younger, she's talking about the fictionalized elements, how she was making up concepts and was writing often very dark matter that she had never personally experienced and yet was able to articulate. And so I do question how much of this is a reliable or an unreliable narration. I don't have an answer to that, but I'm interested in her relationship with fictionalized narrative because that's the thing that I think is most fascinating. The fact that she is so easily able to make stuff up and yet fully kind of punch you in the gut with this hard hitting subject matter. But how does that relate to then writing autobiographical work? That's a question that I'm still sitting with. And then I have been dipping in and out of There Lives a Young Girl in Me Who Will Not Die, which is a group of selected poems that span 4 decades of her writing career. So we do get this sense of, I think, themes being rehashed, themes being rewritten, a sense of her coming at things and subjects from different angles. There are like 4 poems called Divorce, for example, Divorce 1, Divorce 2, Divorce 3, Divorce 4. Her style is deliberately very simple. It's not particularly florid. And I think that that adds to sort of her relatability and a sense that somebody's on the other side of the room and they're looking straight into your soul. I think that's her kind of approach to writing poetry. She kind of hits you where it hurts. I'm a really big fan. I think she's better than Sylvia Plath. I think she is writing kind of similarly, or kind of what people think Sylvia Plath is writing, but I think she's doing it better. That's my controversial opinion of the day. I think she is better than Sylvia Plath, and I think everybody should read it and tell me if they agree. So that's my little cozy classics update. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I've been mentioning. Let me know what your idea of a cozy classics autumn is, and also let me know what you have been reading recently. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Happy reading!